The first images the world would remember were carefully composed, almost cinematic in their perfection. Black and white photographs of bombers slicing through the clouds, sunlight glinting off aluminum wings, seemed to tell a simple story. Europe united against a tyrant, an allied symphony of steel and courage. British narrators recounted the raids in documentaries produced after the war, their voices steady, almost reverent. Flags fluttered across the screen, the red, white, and blue of Britain interlaced with the stars and stripes of their partners. Triumph was collective, and the eye was drawn to the banners, not the mechanics behind the mission. Yet the story those photographs told was partial, carefully edited. Behind the lens, the planes were unmistakably American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, their factory numbers and fuselage markings invisible to casual viewers but obvious to those who knew where to look. The sprawling yards of Boeing and Consolidated in Seattle and San Diego, the roars of assembly lines that never stopped, the engineers who calculated the tolerances of every rivet, these were the hidden engines of the campaign. The war did not pause for national pride, but history would blur the lines. The dead, too, were largely American. In the first months of daylight bombing over occupied Europe, crews were consumed at a pace that made each mission a calculus of survival. They were shot from the sky, frozen at altitude, trapped in flaming fuselages, their losses cataloged in figures that felt abstract until one read the names young men from Iowa, Pennsylvania, California, their letters still unsent, their photographs stored in family albums that would never see the silver screen. In the post-war narratives, these losses were smoothed into a collective sacrifice, part of an allied effort that glossed over who had truly borne the weight. Documentaries framed the air campaign as a shared endeavor. Triumph appeared egalitarian, moral, inevitable, yet the machinery, mechanical and human, was singular. American factories churned bombers at a pace Britain could never match, and American crews were fed into the sky with a willingness to absorb losses that made strategy possible. Each image of a formation crossing the clouds suggested equal partnership, but the truth was asymmetrical, hidden beneath the cinematic sweep of wings and flags. This was not a critique born of envy. It was an observation of scale, of attribution, of memory. The story was being written even as the smoke from the first raids rose before American factories roared to life, before the first daylight formations crossed the channel. The night skies over Europe were filled with shadows and uncertainty. Britain's early bombing campaign, conducted under the cover of darkness, was desperate and imprecise. Cities glowed with fires, but the pattern was chaotic. German industrial centers often remained untouched, while residential districts bore the brunt of incendiary attacks. The intention was strategic, but the execution was limited by technology, by visibility, and by the ever-present fear of losses too great to bear. The Royal Air Force pressed on night after night, but the cost was immediate and severe. Bomber command crews vanished into the black. Many, never to return. Aircraft disappeared into flak, into night fighters, into the fog of inexperience. Each sortie became a grim lottery, and the losses already unsustainable mounted with relentless precision. Historians would later catalog the attrition, yet at the time the figures were quieted by necessity and by morale. Public confidence demanded optimism. The grim arithmetic remained largely unspoken. Targets intended for destruction were often missed. Entire industrial districts survived the raids intact, while surrounding suburbs were reduced to rubble. Precision, the hallmark of an effective air campaign, was largely a dream. In its place rose morale bombing, a doctrine born less of strategy than of desperation, a hope that terror alone might erode the enemy's will. It did not. German defenses adapted with ruthless efficiency. Cities learned to black out, factories camouflaged their assembly lines, and radar-guided interceptions grew sharper with each night. What the Allies intended as a hammer struck only fragments. By the summer of 1941, the air war was stalling. Losses consumed entire squadrons, and the strategic effect remained marginal. The narrative outside the press was of progress, of shared purpose and advancing fronts, but the truth was far more precarious. Commanders whispered of the limitations, of the inadequacy of tactics and technology, yet publicly, no one admitted it. Britain pressed on, pushing men into the night sky with courage and hope that alone could substitute for results. Within this uncertainty, a new calculus was about to enter the equation, What Britain could not achieve alone, what could not be forced through attrition or darkness. When America joined the war in December 1941, it brought more than manpower, it brought an obsession. Unlike the British, who had adapted to darkness and uncertainty, the United States saw the sky as a laboratory, a place where calculations and discipline could transform hope into results. Daylight bombing was no accident. It was deliberate, precise, and unyielding. Every formation, every altitude, every turn was dictated by a doctrine that valued measurement over improvisation, mathematics over instinct. The Americans believed in the efficacy of air power the way an engineer believes in steel and torque. It is not suggestion, it is law. Industrial targets were chosen with surgical care. Factories producing engines, ball bearings, and fuel were prioritized over population centers. There was no terror doctrine, no moral compromise for psychological effect. Each mission was designed to remove Germany's capacity to fight, systematically dismantling the architecture of war. At first, the approach seemed audacious. Pilots flew in tight formations, confident that overlapping fields of fire and coordinated routes could fend off fighters and flak. To outsiders, it appeared arrogant. To some, dangerously optimistic. Yet within this confidence lay a cold precision, a willingness to embrace risk in pursuit of an exact outcome. The obsession extended beyond tactics to training and procedure. Crews drilled relentlessly on formation flying, gunnery, and bombing calculations. Day after day, men were taught to trust the machine of war as much as their instruments. There was no room for improvisation in this world. Deviation was dangerous, costly. America's doctrine demanded obedience to procedure, a belief that human error could be minimized and that attrition could be absorbed if replacement was steady and disciplined. Each sortie was a test not only of courage, but of industrial endurance, the alignment of human skill and mechanical production. This focus on precision made America's approach distinct and immediately consequential. While the RAF labored through darkness and randomness, the American crews pursued accuracy like a scientific principle. Bombs fell on factories and refineries rather than indiscriminately on cities. Losses were anticipated, weighed, and incorporated into planning. Optimism was not naive. It was the product of confidence in a system that had been conceived from the ground up to endure, to reproduce, and to overwhelm. The implications were profound. Where others had relied on chance and attrition, America relied on calculation and scale. It sounded. By 1942, the American war machine had shifted from concept to overwhelming reality. Thousands of heavy bombers rolled off assembly lines that never slept, their engines echoing across factory floors like distant thunder. The B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were not just aircraft. They were the embodiment of industrial determination, each one a product of meticulous design, unyielding schedules, and a workforce that had internalized the urgency of global conflict. Europe, watching from afar, could scarcely comprehend the scale. Entire fleets emerged from nothing, seemingly overnight, as if the Atlantic itself were being spanned by production lines rather than ships. Crews were trained with astonishing speed, often faster than experience could accumulate. Young men from across the United States learned to fly, navigate, and fight in formations while absorbing doctrines that demanded precision under fire. They were taught to trust the machine as much as their own instincts, to believe that discipline and procedure could outmatch the chaos of battle. Yet with every accelerated class, every replacement crew, the human cost became a shadow looming over the airfields. Experience, the hardest teacher, would now be imparted in fire and lost thousands of feet above enemy territory. Entire air fleets were created from this combination of metal, mathematics, and manpower. Squadrons that had been nothing more than a plan on a map now gathered on distant bases, engines humming in unison, propellers cutting the early morning light. Allied commanders in London and Paris watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This was not merely cooperation, it was industrial takeover. A single nation had constructed a force capable of redefining the skies over Europe, and it did so with an intensity and scale that left allies momentarily speechless. Europe itself seemed to recoil. German intelligence, long accustomed to calculating British sorties by night, now faced fleets that could deliver precise daylight strikes with devastating potential. The scale of America's production was staggering. factories churning out dozens of bombers each week, parts sourced and shipped across the country, training schools expanding with each passing month. The air war had transformed from a series of cautious experiments into an unrelenting engine, one powered as much by calculation as courage. This was more than an alliance. It was a statement of capacity, of resolve. The machine reshaped strategy simply by existing, where once raids had been limited by endurance, experience, and opportunity. They now advanced with relentless momentum. Commanders planned offensives around industrial rhythm rather than mere tactical advantage. The Americans had not only entered the war, they had constructed the weapon that would dominate it, and in doing so, they altered the balance in ways that would soon become undeniable. And yet, for all the precision and speed, a question lingered in the corridors of planning rooms and factories when the first American formations crossed the European sky. The promise of precision collided with the brutality of reality. The bombers flew unescorted, a testament to doctrine and optimism, but also a vulnerability that German fighters exploited with merciless efficiency. The Luftwaffe, alert and deadly, descended on the formations like a storm, tearing gaps through the tight columns of aluminum. Engines roared, guns spat fire, and men who had trained for months found themselves in a battle that no simulator could replicate. The losses were immediate and terrifying. Aircraft disappeared into clouds of smoke and flame, their crews burning, freezing, or vanishing into the Atlantic and the North Sea. Missions designed to cripple industrial targets instead became a ledger of attrition, with 20 to 30% of planes failing to return. Each name on the manifest represented a life interrupted, a family waiting for letters that would never arrive. Survival, once assumed, was suddenly uncertain. The theory that discipline and formation could conquer the sky seemed fragile under the weight of experience. And yet, even as the losses mounted, the machine pressed on. Replacement crews were fed into the system with grim efficiency. Factories continued to churn out aircraft, each one a lifeline and a symbol of relentless industrial capacity. Doctrine, once theoretical, was tested and reshaped mid-flight in the midst of chaos. The air campaign was no longer an experiment. It was a crucible refining strategy through the flames of sacrifice. What began as a projection of confidence now bore the imprint of death, yet the overarching plan remained intact. The crews understood, in a way that numbers could not fully convey, that each mission was a gamble, not of bravado, but of calculation. Experience arrived too late for many, absorbed only by the survivors. Every sortie tested the limits of formation flying, of defensive gunnery, and of human endurance. At altitudes of 20,000 feet, with oxygen masks tight against frostbitten skin, the men became part of a system larger than themselves, their courage inseparable from the relentless logic of American industrial warfare. Europe watched in grim fascination as the first raids unfolded. Allied observers recognized the scale and the ambition, but the human cost was often invisible, obscured by headlines, by propaganda, by the emerging narrative of inevitable victory. The machine was proving itself, not through gentle victories, but through endurance and loss. Each mission chipped away at the Luftwaffe's defenses, even as it demanded a toll that would echo for generations. And still, the theory endured. Despite staggering casualties, the belief in precision, in daylight formation, in industrial endurance. As the losses mounted in the skies over Europe, the American response was neither denial nor retreat. Each figure was recorded, analyzed, and folded into planning with a precision that was almost clinical. Losses were calculated, not mourned publicly. In press releases, in briefings, the sacrifices were summarized in percentages, statistics, abstractions. Behind the numbers lay real men, real families, real grief. But the machinery of war required a different kind of accounting, one where emotion was subordinated to scale and strategy. Replacement crews were sent into the air as soon as training allowed. Men who had only weeks of experience faced the same skies that had claimed seasoned veterans. The attrition that might have broken lesser forces became a forcing function for the doctrine itself. Factories churned relentlessly, producing aircraft faster than funerals could be held, faster than grief could settle. It was an industrial rhythm that imposed its own logic. The machine demanded continuity, and continuity demanded the substitution of life for production, courage for calculation. Doctrine, too, was refined amid catastrophe. Bombing runs were adjusted on the fly. Formations shifted. Gunnery patterns adapted. The losses were not mistakes, they were data points, each one informing the next sortie. And yet, even as young men burned or froze in the thin air above Germany, the machine pressed forward. The system tolerated death in a way that seemed impossible from the ground, converting human cost into operational learning. Each mission, each tragedy, refined the instrument of war into a force that would dominate the skies. Promises of long-range escorts were made but not yet fulfilled. Pilots flew into fire without the protection they had been told was coming, relying on formation discipline and overlapping fields of fire to survive. The cost was evident, but the resolve never wavered. This was not bravery in the heroic sense. It was stubbornness, writ in metal and sweat, an industrial willpower that refused to yield to the immediate horrors of the moment. Survival became secondary to endurance, calculation more important than comfort, persistence more valuable than life itself. Europe watched with unease as America continued to feed the machine, its losses tolerated as part of a larger equation. Observers could see that the doctrine, the scale, and the production were extraordinary, yet the human cost remained almost invisible to public eyes. The machine was teaching a lesson in persistence and precision, one that demanded both admiration and discomfort. The war, for the Americans, was no longer a series of sorties. It was an ongoing proof of concept, a demonstration that strategy, scale, and relentless application could bend reality to human will. And yet, the question lingered in the minds of those who measured. As the American daylight bombing campaign pressed forward, the British night offensive continued on its separate path. Across the Channel, RAF crews flew under darkness, their missions slower, less precise, yet strategically persistent. In the stark contrast between night and day, the division of labor became painfully evident. One force absorbed the brunt of enemy attention while the other struck under the cover of shadows. What Britain quietly recognized and seldom acknowledged was that the Americans were bearing a disproportionate share of the risk. German defenses, already stretched by relentless Allied pressure, began to falter under this dual approach. The Luftwaffe was forced to respond to threats across the sky at all hours, dividing fighters and flak batteries between night raids and daylight formations. American crews, flying unescorted for months, drew fire with a regularity that was both tragic and strategic. Losses climbed, staggering in scale, while British forces often escaped the same intensity. The calculus of survival became stark. One nation's men were consumed at far greater rates to preserve the broader war effort. Quiet relief replaced overt criticism. Commanders acknowledged in private the toll that American operations exacted, yet publicly, the narrative remained one of unity and shared purpose. The burden was not evenly distributed, but to question it openly would have undermined cohesion, morale, and the emerging story of Allied triumph. Europe's skies had become a theater of both courage and calculation, and the American willingness to endure devastation allowed the machine of war to continue functioning at full force. The imbalance was apparent not only in human loss, but in operational effect. American precision bombing absorbed the attention of German interceptors, thinning defenses and providing space for night raids and subsequent operations. What might have been catastrophic attrition and isolation instead became a lever, a grim mechanism through which strategy could bend enemy resources. The moral weight, however, remained acute. Young men, trained and dispatched in rapid cycles, were sacrificed in a manner both deliberate and unavoidable. Victory, when it arrived, would be collective, yet its costs were concentrated. In the shadows of planning rooms and behind the statistics of sorties, the truth lingered. The war in the air depended on America's extraordinary scale, endurance, and willingness to absorb punishment. Allies watched, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with quiet unease, while the full price was measured in burned-out cockpits, shattered formations, and the empty bunks of replacement crews. It was a calculus few were willing to articulate, that success could demand asymmetrical suffering, and that strategy, rather than fairness, would define survival. And yet, despite the imbalance, the campaign persisted. The machine moved forward, reshaping the Luftwaffe, stretching defenses, and setting the conditions for a turning point that would not be measured in months but in decisive, irreversible moments in the skies above Germany. As the battered formations returned from yet another raid, the men who survived sensed an unspoken truth. The war was being won, but not equally. And the question that would soon define the next phase was unavoidable. How much more could America endure before the machine demanded everything it could extract? For months, American bombers had flown largely unescorted, their crews exposed to the full force of the Luftwaffe. Each mission was a gamble with lives, metals, and machinery, a brutal experiment in endurance. Then, in mid-1943, long-range fighters finally entered the fray. P-51 Mustangs, armed and capable of accompanying bombers deep into German territory, changed the calculus of survival. The machine that had already absorbed so much loss now gained a shield, a force multiplier that allowed doctrine and ambition to manifest without the immediate specter of annihilation. German interceptors, once unchallenged hunters, began to face the relentless counter of long-range escort fighters. Dogfights erupted across the skies, the thunder of engines punctuated by tracers and smoke. For the first time, bombers reached their targets largely intact, their formations holding against the attack. Industrial centers, once threatened by attrition more than precision, now burned in measured waves of destruction. Engines, aircraft, and ammunition plants were consumed, the architecture of the Nazi war effort unraveling with every sortie. The collapse of oil production followed with devastating speed. Synthetic refineries, critical to Germany's mechanized war machine, became the focal point of strategic bombing. As pipelines and factories were destroyed, the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain fuel for its own aircraft, grounding fighters and bombers alike. The balance of power, long preserved by German resilience and tactical skill, began to shift irreversibly. The machine, built at terrifying speed and refined through relentless loss, was finally unopposed in its operational intent. This was the moment the war in Europe truly turned, not through a single strike, nor through the heroics of one pilot or commander, but through the combination of scale, precision, and industrial persistence. American production, now protected and guided by experience, could deliver destruction with an efficiency that German defenses could no longer counter. Each mission stripped the enemy of both material and morale, demonstrating the calculus of attrition and endurance on an unprecedented scale. Yet the triumph was inseparable from the cost already paid. Thousands of lives had already been consumed to prove the doctrine, to refine the formations, to feed the machine until it could operate at full capacity. Now, with long-range fighters providing the support that had once been absent, the strategy came into its own, but its effectiveness was inseparable from the suffering it had required. Survival was no longer a role of chance. It was the reward for endurance and industrial might. The skies over Germany, once a domain of fear and vulnerability, now became a corridor of calculated destruction. Factories burned, refineries collapsed, and the Luftwaffe's ability to defend itself disintegrated under the coordinated pressure of bombers and escorts. The turning point was clear. The war in the air was no longer tentative. It was decisive. And yet, as targets burned and the enemy faltered, the question persisted in the minds of those who had survived the earlier, darker months. Would the machine, now unopposed, continue to absorb cost with such relentless efficiency? Or would the human toll eventually demand a reckoning that even the factories could not provide? When the war in Europe ended, the narrative began to shift almost immediately. In documentaries, textbooks, and public memory, the language softened, smoothing the sharp edges of reality. We replaced they, and the nuance of national contribution blurred into a collective story. The American crews who had flown into fire unescorted, who had borne the heaviest losses and endured the longest missions, were folded into a shared triumph. The machinery of victory became a collective abstraction, its authorship almost invisible beneath the weight of Allied unity. Losses, once counted meticulously in operational reports, were generalized. Figures were aggregated, nations were cited together, and the scale of American sacrifice, thousands of dead, tens of thousands wounded, was muted in the telling. Strategic bombing, once a precise and controversial operation, became wisdom of the Allied enterprise. The doctrine, the calculations, the industrial capacity that had made daylight precision bombing possible, these were remembered, if at all, as features of collective effort, rather than as the product of a single nation's ingenuity and endurance. Responsibility, too, was diffused. Decisions that had cost lives, that had risked young men on unescorted missions, were reframed as shared judgment. The moral weight of choice, of who had sent whom into the sky and under what doctrine, became softened in the narratives of unity. Authorship disappeared. The factories that had produced thousands of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, the engineers who had designed and scaled the program, the planners who had risked theory against reality all receded into the background of an Allied victory. In classrooms, in films, in public commemorations, the distinctions blurred further. Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States became a monolith of victory. The intricate story of scale, of endurance, of who absorbed the cost to make the strategy work, was replaced by a comfortable abstraction. Those who had sacrificed most became part of a collective memory, honored as heroes, yet their specific contribution and the staggering human toll faded behind the narrative of shared triumph. It was a lesson in perception as much as in history. Memory privileges cohesion over accuracy. Nations eager to celebrate victory and to move toward peace allowed the story to simplify. The dead, once meticulously counted and recorded by nationality, were transformed into symbols of the Allied effort, their individuality lost in service to a broader narrative. The machine that had delivered victory, the American industrial and human engine, was now invisible beneath the triumph it had made possible. And so, the story changed. Where once precise doctrine and immense sacrifice had defined the air war, only the idea of Allied unity remained. Yet the echoes of cost, of scale, and of responsibility lingered in the archives, in letters, and in the silent wings of airfields long since emptied. Those who look closely can still trace the outline of what was uniquely American, a machine that bore the heaviest burden and changed the war, even as history chose to speak in the first-person plural. As the celebrations faded and the world rebuilt, the question endured: how much of the story had been reshaped by those who survived, and how much by those who were silent? The answer, like the machines themselves, was enormous, precise, and almost impossible to overlook. The scale of American sacrifice in the air war is almost unimaginable. When the figures are laid bare, the human cost dwarfs any expectation. Thousands of bomber crews, young men plucked from towns and cities across the United States, never returned from missions over Germany and occupied Europe. Entire generations were erased, swallowed by flak, fighters, freezing altitudes, and fire. Letters never delivered, photographs left behind on mantles, families forever changed. The abstract numbers of history become unbearable when confronted with the weight of individual lives. U.S. aircraft production, meanwhile, was staggering. By the end of the war, America had produced more bombers than all other nations combined, and at a pace that could not have been matched by any ally. B-17 seconds, B-24 seconds, and eventually B-29 seconds rolled off assembly lines in continuous waves. Each aircraft represented not only steel and machinery, but the labor of thousands of engineers, factory workers, and mechanics, a web of production that functioned as the backbone of strategy. The system worked only at American scale, a combination of industry and human endurance that no other nation could replicate. Casualties in production together reveal a stark truth. Victory depended on the willingness of a single nation to absorb cost, risk, and logistical strain at an intensity unmatched anywhere else. Allies referenced the results carefully, in books, in speeches, and in documentaries. Yet the arithmetic of sacrifice was rarely separated by nationality. The scale of America's contribution, its crews, its planes, its industrial rhythm, was both obvious and invisible, recognized in outcome, but minimized in narrative. Every sortie, every formation, every calculation of fuel, bomb load, and defensive fire represented a system that could only function because it could replace losses faster than they occurred. The human toll, though staggering, was built into the mechanics of the machine. For every bomber lost, another was ready, and behind each crew flown into danger was another crew in training. The logic was brutal, the calculus merciless, and the reality unavoidable. The air war was a testament to American scale, endurance, and industrial capacity. No ally could replicate this system. The RAF, despite skill and courage, could not achieve the same throughput or absorb the same loss rates. The Soviets, despite numerical superiority, lacked the combination of production, doctrine, and logistical integration necessary for sustained precision bombing. Yet the narrative of post-war unity often flattened these distinctions. References to strategic bombing became collective, its human costs shared in abstraction, even as the machines and the men behind them had been overwhelmingly American. The numbers, however, remain. They speak in quiet defiance of simplified memory. The lives erased in aluminum, the factories that hummed without pause, the doctrine refined amid blood and fire. They are a reminder that victory has a price, one paid unevenly, one accounted for meticulously in reports and quietly in memory, but too often softened in the story we tell ourselves. And as historians examine the archives, they are confronted with the truth. The machine worked because America bore it, and nothing, not scale, not strategy, not alliance, could replicate what it took to turn calculation into conquest. After the war, the story of victory was written with broad strokes, and America's role in the air campaign quietly faded into the collective narrative. But this was not an oversight born of arrogance or neglect. There was a psychology to restraint, shaped by exhaustion. The nation had poured its sons into the sky, its factories into the clouds, and its morale into the uncertainty of battle. By the time victory arrived, Americans were weary not just physically, but morally, emotionally, and politically. To insist on recognition felt like reopening wounds that had already begun to heal. Guilt played its part. Survivors and planners alike understood the human cost embedded in the machine they had created. Thousands of young men had been consumed in a strategy that only worked because of scale, endurance, and relentless application. The thought of publicly separating American sacrifice from the narrative of Allied triumph risked appearing self-congratulatory, insensitive, or divisive. In silence, the memory of those who died remained intact, but the national story softened, folding the contribution into a broader, less precise whole. There was also a conscious desire for unity. The post-war world required cohesion, not dissection. Europe was rebuilding, relationships were fragile, and the seeds of the Cold War were already taking root. Any insistence on precise attribution might have strained alliances, undercutting the sense of shared victory that leaders believed was necessary to sustain peace. Letting allies save face became a quiet priority, a moral calculus intertwined with diplomacy. Victory felt sufficient, its justification apparent, and credit for the mechanics of success, though deserved, was deemed unnecessary in the public discourse. Strategic considerations reinforced this choice. The emerging geopolitical tension with the Soviet Union required an emphasis on collective strength, not individual achievement. Historians and commentators, guided by official narratives and political expediency, reinforced the collective memory. American planners, engineers, and crews understood that the lessons of the air campaign would endure, even if the national attribution did not. The machinery had performed, the skies had been dominated, Europe had been liberated. Recognition, they reasoned, was a luxury in a world that demanded cooperation over celebration. Ultimately, the decision not to correct the record was both pragmatic and human. Exhaustion, guilt, and the desire to preserve international relationships outweighed the impulse to claim individual authorship. Americans allowed the story to become allied, even when the evidence, the planes, the crews, the factories remained indisputably their own. The magnitude of their contribution, though largely hidden in narrative, remained engraved in the skies they had dominated and in the archives of production and planning. And so, the choice was made: to let memory simplify, to let unity prevail, and to accept that history would not always distinguish between effort and attribution. But beneath the polished narrative, the truth lingered, waiting to be read in letters, in manifests, and in the silent aluminum skeletons of the machines that had carried men into the fire. As the world celebrated a shared victory, a quieter truth endured. America had absorbed the machine, paid the cost, and, in doing so, had reshaped history almost without notice. History is rarely a precise accounting. It is, more often, a reflection of what nations choose to celebrate. Memory favors the loud, the triumphant speeches, the victories broadcast across radio waves, the images that flatter a nation's self-image. Films simplify. condensing months of planning, sacrifice, and experimentation into narratives that are accessible, satisfying, and reassuring. The complex calculus of industrial warfare, the human toll absorbed in quiet anonymity, is rarely dramatized. It is too uncomfortable, too precise, too real. Narration compresses events, smoothing the ragged edges of loss into a seamless story of shared triumph. What was once a machine of death and endurance becomes an abstract tool in the mythology of victory. The men who burned and froze in the skies, the replacements fed into the engine before grief could settle, the engineers who calculated tolerances in factories far from the front, all are diminished in the collective retelling. Sacrifice becomes shared abstraction, human specificity lost to the broader narrative of Allied courage. The machine, once visible in every formation, every sortie, every carefully timed mission, gradually loses its fingerprints. Its scale and its mechanics are overshadowed by symbols and slogans. The spectacle of aircraft flying in formation over cities and countryside. The dead lose their individuality. Names, hometowns, and personal letters dissolve into a generalized notion of heroism. Historians may preserve the data, but public memory rarely engages with the nuance, preferring the comfort of simplified story. This simplification is not accidental. Nations, like individuals, prefer to remember what flatters them, what aligns with pride, unity, and moral righteousness. To dwell on the magnitude of American sacrifice alone would challenge the narrative of shared effort, introduce moral discomfort, and complicate gratitude. In museums, films, and documentaries, the lines of attribution blur. Strategic bombing becomes collective wisdom, a triumph of Allied air power rather than a testament to one nation's extraordinary scale and endurance. Yet, the consequences of this compression are profound. The human cost is hidden beneath abstractions, the moral weight of decisions, the deliberate absorption of losses, and the grinding calculations of survival fade from collective consciousness. Those who paid the heaviest price are remembered only as part of a group, their individual courage subsumed into an idea, their deaths rendered digestible, morally unchallenging. History, in pursuit of comfort, sacrifices clarity. And so, memory rewards the loud, not the costly. The narratives we inherit are the ones that inspire pride, that avoid uncomfortable questions, that simplify endurance into inspiration. The true engine of victory, the American crews, the factories, the doctrine refined mid-death becomes nearly invisible, its imprint muted beneath abstraction. As the world turns its attention to celebration and remembrance, one truth endures quietly, in letters, manifests, and abandoned airfields. The costliest victories are rarely the ones loudly remembered. The machines had flown, the men had fallen, and history, for comfort, had softened their edges. The B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were often described as machines, as flying fortresses, as instruments of destruction, but the machine that dominated the skies was never just metal. Its power lay equally in logistics, in the invisible networks that fed fuel, bombs, and crews into the air. Every sortie depended on warehouses, rail lines, supply chains, and maintenance crews who ensured that the next mission could lift off without fail. Without this infrastructure, the aluminum skeletons of the bombers were meaningless. Training was another pillar of the machine. Young men arrived at airfields with little experience and were transformed into disciplined operators capable of flying formations across hostile skies. The instruction was relentless, precise, and unyielding. Crews drilled day after day, repeating maneuvers, gunnery exercises, and navigation in simulators and on the ground, embedding patterns that would save or claim their lives in combat. Each bomber was only as effective as the men inside it, and the training program was the hidden engine that made scale possible. Replacement math was perhaps the most unspoken yet essential element. Losses were calculated, projected, and absorbed into the schedule of missions. Crews were rotated, trained, and inserted into units as quickly as experience allowed. Death and injury were counted in formulas as much as they were mourned. The system relied on the willingness of a nation to feed it consistently, to accept that some would never return, and that others would fly in their place tomorrow, their courage inseparable from the machine itself. Moral acceptance of loss underpinned every decision. Commanders, engineers, and pilots internalized a grim truth. The campaign could only succeed if the cost was tolerated. Men were not disposable in theory, but in practice, The machine required endurance beyond sentiment. The decision to continue after staggering losses was not a question of heroism. It was a demonstration of capacity, of the ability to integrate human sacrifice into operational continuity without faltering, to fly another mission after witnessing destruction, to step into the same cold aluminum fuselage, to trust in formations, gunners, and calculation. This required more than bravery. It required a willingness to absorb punishment, to internalize the inevitability of loss, and to keep flying tomorrow. The machine demanded repetition, persistence, and resilience at every level, from the aircrew to the assembly line. Its effectiveness was inseparable from human endurance, from the moral and physical stamina embedded in each mission. This was not heroism, as the world often imagines it, lone acts of valor or celebrated feats. It was a capacity, a calculated endurance of individuals and institutions alike, that allowed strategy to become reality. The machine flew not because men were fearless, but because they were disciplined, replaced, and willing to continue. Its power lay in continuity, in the integration of logistics, training, replacement, and acceptance into a single, unbroken engine of war. And as the crews readied themselves for another sortie, they were not just men in planes, they were the living components of a machine that demanded persistence above all, a machine that turned human endurance into strategic victory. The story of the American bombing machine unsettles because it challenges the myths of shared victory. History prefers tidy narratives, collective courage, mutual sacrifice, and the comforting symmetry of cooperation. To suggest that one nation carried a disproportionate burden disrupts this equilibrium. It forces the audience to reconsider the familiar tales of triumph, to see that victory was not evenly distributed, and that the cost was measured in human lives, not abstract glory. Effort and credit, normally assumed to coincide, are sharply separated in this story. The men who flew unescorted over hostile skies, the factories that produced thousands of aircraft, the planners who calculated loss and replacement all did work that was both essential and dangerous. Yet in the post-war narrative, their singular contribution fades into the collective we. To confront this truth is to confront discomfort that the machinery of victory relied on extraordinary endurance that was neither acknowledged fully nor fairly remembered. Fairness itself becomes a moral question. Who bore the cost of coalitions, and who received the recognition? American crews, American factories, American systems. These were the engines that made strategic bombing feasible, and they paid in human life at rates unmatched by allies. The distribution of sacrifice was uneven, yet the reward of memory and credit was flattened. To acknowledge this disparity is to unsettle not only history, but the moral calculus of gratitude, forcing reflection on the hidden inequities embedded within victory. Sacrifice, once specific and measurable, becomes abstracted in comfortable retellings. Individual deaths, the grinding exhaustion of repeated missions, the emotional and physical toll on men and families, all dissolve into collective memory. The narrative favors cohesion over clarity, inspiration over discomfort. Yet the truth endures, visible in the letters, manifests, and production reports that mark the immense scale of effort. It is a truth that complicates gratitude, for it suggests that victory was purchased at a cost that was not equally shared. This is why the story is often avoided or simplified. It is uncomfortable precisely because it asks audiences to confront asymmetry, to reconcile admiration with unease, and to separate heroism from calculation. It challenges the notion that collective success implies equal contribution. It reminds us that the machinery of war, its doctrine, logistics, and human endurance was grounded in extraordinary effort concentrated in a single nation. Yet the discomfort is also the lesson. History, when examined with clarity, demands that we understand not only the outcome, but the mechanics, the choices, and the cost. It forces reflection on who pays when coalitions win, and on the moral complexity that lies beneath apparent unity. The American machine was decisive, effective, and lethal, but it leaves a legacy of questions that are difficult, even painful, to answer. And so, as the stories of triumph are told in simplified terms, the uneasy truth waits quietly in the wings, that the costliest victories, the ones requiring the most endurance, often remain invisible, their complexity uncomfortable for collective memory. The Allied air war did, In the end, win Europe. Cities were liberated, industrial networks shattered, and the Luftwaffe broken. From the outside, it is easy to tell the story as collective triumph, a coalition united in purpose, a synchronized effort that delivered victory. Yet the truth, quieter and more precise, lies beneath the surface of flags, speeches, and documentaries. The machinery that made the skies over Germany a dominion of Allied power was largely American in conception, in execution, and in endurance. It ran on American factories, each one a cathedral of steel and machinery, humming day and night. Every B-17, every B-24, every replacement part reflected the rhythm of production that no other nation could sustain. American crews, young men drawn from towns and farms across the United States, flew into fire with a consistency and courage born of training, discipline, and grim acceptance. They absorbed punishment, replaced the lost, and continued the mission with a resolve that the war demanded. And it ran on American tolerance for loss. Calculated, anticipated, endured. The scale of human sacrifice was staggering, yet it became the fuel that allowed doctrine, formation, and strategy to manifest fully. The machine required it, and America delivered it, measured and relentless. The dead, the frozen, the burned out, and the missing became the invisible engine of success, their individual presence absorbed into a system that only functioned at this magnitude. Others shared the victory, of course. Britain, the Soviet Union, and the many allies contributed in ways essential to the overall outcome. But the weight of experimentation, the risk of daylight precision bombing, and the initial grinding attrition fell disproportionately on American shoulders. America absorbed the machine, carrying the burden so that the doctrine could be proven, the calculations validated, and the